Well, welcome to the Bible Stories in Scots podcast. I'm your host, Sean Timothy of Clan Fraser. Well, that's my given name anyway. My friends call me Chumley. I thought I'd start out with this trailer in explaining, or rather, giving my own sorry excuse. My grandmother said, a sorry excuse is better than none. But then I had a boss tell me that was an old wives' tale too. To start, I'll tell you a story of my own and how I got started with all of this voiceover bit. It all began 5 years ago, afore the alleged pandemic. In October of 2019, after I had finished my stint as a care provider in Colorado, my wife and I assumed responsibility for my mother, who was diagnosed with dementia. We committed to taking care of her for the remainder of her days. And at that time, we had also found out that my wife's father, in her homeland of Trinidad and Tobago, had come down with dementia and was suffering with prostate and had a pacemaker as well. Well, he wound up homeless. And when we got word of it, we decided that my wife would go ahead of me to Trinidad and Tobago while I liquidated my mother's belongings and estate, moved back to my place from my mother's place in Nevada to South Dakota, where my home was, liquidate that, and join my wife with my mother. Well, like I said, that was October of 2019. I was leery about taking my mother to travel with the protocols during that time. I thought it would be far too traumatic. And she wound up declining rather rapidly. Within 2 years of returning to South Dakota, she had passed away. And fortunately, I had previous training as a care provider, or a nurse aide rather, in a nursing home and had worked night shift. I was well trained and experienced and offered and gave hospice care to a number of residents in the home I served, as well as preparing a good half dozen folks for the undertaker. So, before all that begun, I knew I was in for the greatest challenge and hurdle in my life, and that was to get back to my wife with all that I had to do. At the same time, I was getting a little squirrely, a little stir crazy, so to say, because I was accustomed to working 12, 14-hour days working skilled construction. My fortes were cabinet and trim work, as well as countertop and tile setting. I was beside myself, sitting there twiddling my thumbs, waiting in between meals where I'd prepare something for my mother, and leaving the programs on that she liked to listen to or watch, and playing music and that sort of thing. But it wasn't enough. Until I spoke with an engineer at the church that my mother was a member of, and he mentioned audiobooks. A beacon was lit at that point in time. So I got into it and looked into it, and in my naivety, I wound up getting an inferior mic. I got a lapel mic, not your professional voiceover mic. More or less a broadcast mic. But I was able to meet all the standards for book publication, and I published my first book. Before we left Nevada with my mother, I spoke with my father on the phone, and I told him what I had done in publishing an audiobook. I had never heard him so excited in my entire life over anything I had ever done before. And he said, "What's it about?" And I said, "Well, I read the Psalms." The reason being is this big hurdle and challenge I was facing with getting back and reuniting with my wife with all that I had to do. So I thought it would set my mind aright, renew my thinking, and it would be at the same time divinely inspired prayers and petitions to the Master, Almighty, Almighty. So he said with that, he could not wait to hear it. Well, the day I went to pick up the U-Haul trailer to move my mom back to my place in South Dakota, my sister called to let me know that my father had passed away. That was 2 weeks after I had spoke with him. He didn't even have a chance to listen to my recording. As inferior as it was, with the equipment and my inexperience with narrating, it's been said that nae mony of us come fae he close families. And it was just so, and it was like so with my family. My father was a custodian. He cleaned buildings for the school district. And my mother was a mere bookkeeper, accountant for various different businesses. So with that, even with that, my father and my mother had the good fortune of having pensions back in the day when that was a going rate for pay. And it was a good job back in the day. They're hard to come by nowadays. But he left me and my other 5 siblings a small inheritance. It was literally less than $2,600. But with that, I was able to purchase this mic, an AKG C214 or 214, a digital recorder, and a laptop computer for processing it all and editing. So I began recording, and my next project was the entire New Testament in the Christian Bible from the Christian Bible Society. After that, I got my hands on a copy of the Doric New Testament, rendered in Doric by Gordon Hay. I read that in its entirety over my YouTube channel. It took 8 months, and it was cringy to say the least, but I think I got a little bit better. And the reason being is I always had an interest in interactive performance acting, and I had no clue what that was all about and what it involved. It was just something, and a number of times it come across in my life experience. And I finally came to the conclusion that that was what I wanted to do. And part of that was developing an authentic dialect to portray as a character in this interactive theater performance. That came from my heritage with my father being from Clan Fraser. Now, the interesting thing is, and I'm sure you've heard enough of these stories from enough diaspora, sorry American tourists, but my father, his father, my grandfather, come fae the brook when he was 12 years old. And from there, he worked as a butcher with his father in a meat market. And to my best understanding, they had charter privileges for travel. So they migrated to Canada and came down through Canada and settled in Jamestown, North Dakota, where they started their own meat market. Now, my uncle, my dad's older brother, The firstborn son, George Jr. Fraser, spent a lot of time with his father, who immigrated straight from the Broch and spoke Doric. Well, my uncle said that he learned to speak from his father with spending time with him, whereas my father was a mere 5 years old when my grandfather enlisted in the army to fight the bad guy in World War II. He had a falling out with his father, who started the meat market in Jamestown with him. They wouldn't speak to each other. Well, my grandfather went off and was killed in action in the Battle of Okinawa, leaving 3 barons fatherless. My dad, being the youngest, was 5 years old. He had no memory of or didn't mind his father in the least bit. But my uncle was 2 years older, and he kent him fine, and spak the same way. All through his high school, secondary school days, where he lost that way of speaking in the Doric and the brogue, the tongue of his father, when he enlisted in the army as well. And there was one thing that my father always mentioned, and that was when he heard coworkers and friends, primarily coworkers, speaking ill of their fathers. He said that he couldn't relate to that because he never had a father and didn't have any memory of him. But my uncle told me about him, and when I found out he was from the northeast of Scotland and spoke the Doric and was from the Broch, I thought that would be the ideal, authentic dialect for myself to pick up. And that's where we begin, and that's where we continue with this season of reading the Old Testament, rendered in Doric by Gordon Hay. In keeping with the theme of Bible stories in Scots, we'll hold to the stories, and we'll pass over the genealogies, the extensive genealogies, and the books of the law, or the law, which we were not commanded to follow as the Gentiles, or those of the other nations, whereas the Hebrews, or the Yaos, were instructed to follow. I'm sure it'd be nice to introduce yourself in the kingdom in paradise to those that were listed in the genealogies properly by name, but I'm sure we'll get the pronunciations wrong. Anywho. So with that, as we go on to read the stories of the Old Testament in Scots, say until next time, behertend, be skillful, and endure till the end.